Welcome. Good evening. This is the First Amendment, historically speaking, and I will be your host. And my name is Frederick Douglass Dixon. As a part two of last week's show, where we discussed the recent events in America that are tied into Eric Garner, Mike Brown, and what has recently happened in the media and the stance that Americans have taken over this current influx and a rise of violence towards young black men in particular in this country by armed or those who have authority, and the consequence that has come from that or the lack thereof. So today I want to go to a part two of what we discussed yesterday, because for clarity and depth, we cannot leave last week's show without reverting to it and bringing forwarding information that will allow us to continue to attempt to build bridges for those who are genuinely thinking of ways that we can repair this situation. Now, I want to use the thoughts of a person who's far wiser than I, and because of what was left behind with his work, it is ultimately important that we allow future generations to know this person, to understand where they can research this particular person, as well as the idea of how important the work that he left behind is. Now, I would consider this work to be a classic. So I want to forward a functional definition of what a classic is. A classic is, in terms of writing, as important today as when that particular issue was brought up or when this particular writing was completed. So a classic is as important today as it was when it was written. So I would like to go right to Dr. Bobby E. Wright. Dr. Bobby E. Wright is the very first black man to graduate the University of Chicago with a PhD in psychology. At the time when Bobby Wright in the 70s, he had the only full-service mental health clinic that was all black in America, very first and perhaps the last, on the west side of Chicago. And Dr. Bobby Wright was indeed a visionary. He was one who was historically accurate, and one that for people of color, more specifically for young black people, you won't hear a lot about Bobby Wright, but today we'll forward that information so that you can research Bobby Wright, which means you can Google Bobby Wright and come up with some of his information to tie into historical accuracy. So today we'll talk about one particular piece that Bobby Wright left behind, which is indeed timeless and a classic. It's called the psychopathic racial personality. Now, when we think about that topic, it holds a lot of weight when we begin to talk about how these terms have been compounded. The psychopathic racial personality. With that being as important as it is, I'd like to use some of Bobby Wright's words to explain just how serious this particular thought was. And this is in the early 70s. So we have to be wise enough to at least put it in its historical context, and then we can value what it has today. So when Bobby Wright starts this particular piece, he begins to talk about American relationships, more specifically black and white race relations in America. And he uses an analogy that's tied to a bullfight. And if you've ever seen a real bullfight, there is what is called a fight to the death. One person will not walk out of that particular arena, the original bullfights. So when he compared the relationship that blacks and whites have grown to be accustomed to, which has set a pace in society, he compared it to a bullfight. And he says, in a bullfight, there comes a time when, after being brutalized while making innumerable charges at the movement of the cape, the bull finally turns and realizes, maybe for the very first time, that his adversary And the only movement in this relationship is the heaving, bloody sides of the bull. It is believed that that particular time, that the first understanding of this relationship becomes very clear. And it is believed at that time, the bull sees the matador for exactly what he is. And this is called the moment of truth and a final confrontation. And sometimes, even when the final confrontation or the moment of truth is at hand and becomes very clear, with veracity, it comes just a bit too late for the bull. So when we talk about Bobby Wright and his importance and his vision, he sets the pace with his analogous situation that he said, in America, the relationship between blacks and whites is a fight to the death. And he begins to say, there's a scientific dictum, and this dictum states that everything that exists in some amount, and if it exists, it can be measured. If it exists, it can be measured. Dr. Bobby Wright's brilliance is unmatchable. It won't be able to be lessened, and that's why we're forwarding it to you. So he begins to talk about the idea of what these banners have represented that black Americans have charged at. He talks about democracy, he talks about capitalism, and he talks about religion. He says those are some of the most important banners that black Americans charge to get to be accepted into middle-class America, to be accepted by those who are in control, and to play a portion of American society that is compliant. So he talks about how technology, now this is in 1974, so I would say that he gauged the idea of where technology was going. He said the industrialization and the rampage resulting of the further exploitation of African resources in turn produces an increase in African consciousness, but now it is a threat and a liability when you have consciousness. He said the ultimate gain and the ultimate outcome of the relationship between the bull and the matador, when the matador is in control, is genocide. So now he's coming with some very strong terms. He's charging America with some very, very serious offenses. Now, for all of those of you who are listening or in our eye shot, this is just one thought. This idea is to expose. This idea is to aims to have people be very critical about the relationships that we do have now in our lives and the relationship that we have in society. So this indeed is a moment of truth for those of us who consider us to be critical thinkers. To raise the issue of looking at a situation like a bullfight where one person perhaps will not survive is indeed critical. And when he talks about scientists in America, he talks about the major researches that scientists are paid to do are genocidal by nature. Nuclear warfare, population control, medical control, genetic engineering, psychosurgery, electrical stimulation, and the complete science of behavioral technology. Dr. Bobby Wright is again proving to us just how wise he is and how ahead of the game, if you will, for a coined term, he was. So now when he talks about, he says, we indeed see the moment of truth, and for that time, we need to look right now at the matador. And then he quotes this, and he says, in their relationship with the black race in America, European and whites are psychopaths, and their behavior reflects an underlying proclivity and a biological connection to their roots that are deeply rooted in their European evolutionary history. So one person who would compliment Bobby Wright is Sheikh Joseph Anta Diop when he talks about black and whites, and he talks about that we have two different origins. There's an article that he wrote called The Two Cradle Theory. the cradle represents the home of two different types of people. So he talks about the northern cradle, which is Europe, and the southern cradle, which is Africa. This ties directly into what Bobby Wright is saying. Bobby Wright is saying that for the most part, we come from two different places, and it's backed up by the brilliance of Sheikh Joseph Anta Diop, who says the differences are what we need to look at when we look at the matador and we look at the bull. And he says the psychopath is an individual who is in constant conflict. One characteristic is a person who is completely selfish, unable to experience guilt, callous, and has a total disregard for the rights of others. Now, I want to go back to these characteristics and think about America and think about the relationship between the two. We talk about constantly in conflict. When we think about America, historically, we have controlled, recent history, we have controlled the world through fear. We have become the most mighty military on the planet. And the rest of the world is not only in agreement with this, but they are in somewhat fear of America's might when it comes to their military. And he says they're unable to experience guilt. Well, when we talk about a group that's unable to experience guilt, you don't hear a lot today about the idea of reparations for the transatlantic slave trades and the sons and daughters and the scions of slaves. When we begin to talk about reparations, which must be on the table if we are attempting to be a post-racial society, then America is indeed charged with, or in the rear, if you will, for those groups of people who built the country. Now, I don't know if you can consider the reservations and things that happen and stolen land from the indigenous people to have some sort of reparations. I'm not that wise to think about that in that way. But I do understand reparations was paid to more than one group of what we would call immigrants in the 1900s. There was a group of Asian people who were paid for being housed or forced to be in internment camps. There was also the idea of what we call Israel and the backs and how that came right off the idea of the Holocaust. So we have some legal precedents to say that we know some people have received reparations for the damage that has been done to their entire group. But yet, today, as we speak, there's nothing on the table that even remotely reminds us of the transatlantic slave trade, the idea of having free labor to have built this country, and then never, ever tacked in to reparations to repair this group monetarily. So I'll give you an idea of what reparations can look like so that we can put it into a contextual framework. Reparations in America should look like land. So the government should give land to the scions of the transatlantic slave trade. There is no power without land. So they should give land to those who have been victims of the transatlantic slave trade. And I'll say this, a wise man said, a very wise man, the most honorable Elijah Muhammad said that America should give 8 to 10 states to blacks with an outlet to the sea so that we could trade with other nations. Now, I know that seems far-fetched because of what we know historically. But if we think about some of the things that have happened, it's not so far-fetched for America to pay reparations, and that's one way they could actually pay reparations. Completely selfish. America seems to, over the years, have become far more selfish and a total disregard for the rights of others. I would say that Bobby Wright is hitting the proverbial bullseye directly in the middle when he gives us those characteristics. And he goes on to say that one of the best methods that can be used in the measure of the psychopathic traits of the white race is observing and analyzing critically the overt behaviors and attitudes towards black. This ties us right back into what has happened recently with Mike Brown and Eric Garner. Overt behavior towards an oppressed group. Overt behavior towards unarmed young black men. Well, I have to be clear and say that when we say unarmed young black men, it's an idea of what it represents. What does it represent? What does the idea of black lives represent in America? It's very hard and a waste of time to look at our current problems and not understand historically how they have developed. So a wise man once said, if the house is to be set in order, we cannot start in the present, but we have to start in the past. Now, Bobby Wright goes on to say, when he talks about the relationship of the bull and the matador, he says this about blacks: merely having intellectual insight about whites does not ensure that there will be a corresponding change in blacks' behavior and attitudes towards them, even when there's a threat involved, or more particularly when there's a threat involved. So what Bobby Wright is saying, he is saying that we have been taught to forgive our open enemy. We have been taught to forgive our oppressor. And he ties this into what we know as religion. So Bobby Wright himself is speaking to a group of people who, I'm sure at the time when he was saying this, it seemed so way out. It seemed so outside of the idea of unification that it could be taken like the idea of David Walker's appeal was taken, that there was no need for this. There was no idea of unification in what he was saying. But I challenge you to listen to what Bobby Wright says. Listen to David Walker and what they said. And if not, you don't find truth in that, then we have to be very particular about what the truth looks like. He goes on to say that when we talk about the idea of our relationship, he says this very clearly. He said, everywhere you find blacks and whites in close proximity, we find the idea that defies universal phenomenon. He says, wherever we find this particular group, whites are in control and blacks are following. Another wise man said something so very wise. He said, wherever you find blacks and whites in close proximity, blacks do the coining, whites do the operating. Some of these particular thoughts may be very hard to digest, but I explain to you, the idea of being comfortable does not trump truth. And there's not one of us who is within this particular thought or is able to see me right now that is more important than the truth. Yes, I say again, the youngest is the most important, but there's not one of us who is more important than truth. So I have to talk about what role that blacks play in our own demise, because we indeed have a huge role in our own demise. So I want to go to the created middle class, that group of people who have over the years traded the truth, traded the idea of fortitude, traded the idea, swapped the idea of future generations' aspirations and inspirations for a minor middle class reward to tie into American middle class life as a springboard to remove them from the same group that they were a part of. So now we are really talking about the mindset. And if you look at the mindset, pay more attention to the teacher than you do the student. When you look at the teacher, you will find the source. When you look to the student, 9 times out of 10, you've been taught to look to the student as the problem. So here we are again, talking about what Bobby Wright called the psychopathic racial personality. He says black intellectual intelligence and enlightenment does not always lead to genuine insight. It can be very damaging for the intellect. Now let's talk about the black intellect. The black intellect has indeed failed the masses of the black community. For a group of letters that come before the name, a group of letters that come after the name, conferred by the same group that has oppressed us. So when you talk about a black intellect, we're talking about the masses, not those of us who sneak through the cracks, who have the fortitude to uncover some of these things. But the masses of black intellectuals are in concert, whether wittingly or unwittingly, with the idea of status quo. And in fact, they are the linchpins. So without black intellects, without the idea of what we call black scholars, who with the strength of Hercules stick up for the status quo, then there would be a lot less of a rigid system to be upheld by future generations. They would not have the idea of simply having an example of a black intellect if it were not one that was accepted by mainstream America. And when we talk about Bobby Wright, he talks about making a fortune out of studying the victims of white oppression. That means studying your own self, not studying the idea of the problem, but studying the idea of what has come from the problem. So I say to Bobby Wright, and I thank him dearly for the fortitude, number one, to be able to forward these thoughts. Number two, for the idea of it being scholarly, brilliantly put together to forward information for the entire future race to be able to take apart, dissect, put it back together, question, and build. Indeed, Bobby Wright makes excellent points. And he talks about you have to understand that science is not neutral. When we talk about science, we want to talk about it being able to be tested time and time and time again. Now let's test the relationship between blacks and whites in America. Well, we tested them over the summer. And what did we come up with? We came up with a young black man killed in the streets. No justice done that day. We came up with what they said was to be a grand jury that under all circumstances had lots of secrecy, had lots of information that was yet to be forwarded, and still to this day, if you look just at the outcome, if you look at simply what the coroner said, this man was murdered, then we understand wholeheartedly what this system is set up to do, because it is indeed moving without hesitation forward towards their ultimate goal. And the ultimate goal is genocide. What we find historically has been genocide. What Bobby Wright is forwarding to us is the idea of avenues and means that have been taken towards genocide. And I want to go directly to the Honorable Professor Willie Dixon Jr.'s work. The charge is genocide, the crime of the U.S. government against the Negro people. 1995, he charges the government with genocide. The Honorable Professor Willie Dixon Jr. leaves this behind. And he says there's three ways that the oppressor deals with the oppressed: emancipation, pacification, and liquidation. Well, we know that intellect, that black intellect, would land in pacification, because I can only say so much if I want to keep tenure. I can only say so much if I want to continue to look like I'm leading the black race. So this is a very complex equation that we put together. How can you forward self-hate in a formal educational setting? And then how can you get the same group that you're teaching to accept it, forward it as historical dictum? This is a brilliant plot. Very psychopathic, very evil and wicked, but very brilliant. And I say that Dr. Bobby Wright and the psychopathic racial personality allows us to look at history and the history of psychology from a man who was unafraid, from a man who was historically accurate, so very well read that you can still find Bobby Wright on YouTube. Now, the brilliance in Bobby Wright, and that is even in the early 70s, Bobby Wright understood what the idea of recording meant. So he recorded lots of his lectures. So I give you what I say is Bobby Wright, and pulling this half an hour won't do enough, but it will introduce you to Bobby Wright. And you can go behind and find Bobby Wright, Dr. Bobby Wright, on YouTube and listen to his lectures. Find out if there's any truth to what he's saying. Find out if you agree or you disagree that when he says, no matter what, when we're in a close proximity, one group controls consistently, another group follows consistently. Where can we find anything other than truth in that, whether it be Chicago or Zimbabwe? So a very wise man said that America is in the business of having blacks look to the pie in the sky while they control the ground under their feet. This is a very touchy subject at times, but well worthy of our commitment, well worthy of our scholarly review, and well worthy of our humorless fervor for future generational success. And I will spin to what Bobby Wright would say at this particular point. He says, because of their lack of ethical and moral development, there is no conflict between the white's religion and racial oppression. The white race has historically oppressed, exploited, and killed black people in the name of their God, Jesus Christ. Well, how do you back that up? That's a very strong statement. How do you back that up? Well, I say that for one particular group, which is a very popular group even today, the Christian Knights of the Ku Klux Klan, indeed was a Christian organization. The Christian Knights of the Ku Klux Klan, 1866, Pulaski, Tennessee. Mr. Lester, Mr. Crow, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. Reed, and Mr. McCord. We're talking about the 6 founding original members. So when Bobby Wright himself forwards the idea of the psychopathic racial personality, he makes it very clear. He uses historical dictums. He challenges those that I consider to be historical dictums, and he makes it very plain. Dr. Bobby Wright, I thank you for the voices that will never be heard. Although he's not here with us, he leaves this behind, and several other ways for us to go back and challenge his work by reading it, number one. So for that very young person out here who does not have a hero, who looks just like you, indeed, Bobby Wright can be a hero because he lived his life in such a manner and left things behind. Again, I would like for us to be able to be far more serious about what it is that we teach our children. I say that Dr. Bobby Wright is very worthy of our research. Ladies and gentlemen, this information may in no means change your mind, but because truth and you are so very important to me, I just thought you ought to know. I remain, with esteem and respect, Frederick Douglass Dixon, a distinguished man of color. Thank you.